Since the pandemic began, we've been checking in, as you know, with RBC's top biotech analyst as he has charted the virus himself. CNBC's pharma reporter Meg Tirrell with us once again tonight with RBC Capital Markets' Kennen MacKay. Meg?
Scott, thanks so much. And Kennen, it's great to have you with us again tonight. As we look at your current modeling, the news doesn't look quite so good. You note in your latest note that the current trend suggests divergence away from recovery here in the U.S. What are you seeing in the numbers?
Yeah, no, and thank you for having me back, Meg. So one of the things that really stands out to us as a concern is sort of where the U.S. is looking at reopening some of our economies as it relates to the number of daily cases and where those stand versus the peak in daily cases that we did see back in early April. And what's really happened is the U.S. has sort of sat on a plateau near the peak in daily cases. So we haven't really come down too much as a number of countries across Europe have, for instance, as they're looking at reopening their economies. And the concern there is that as we talk about another wave of virus sort of coming back as the U.S. either reopens or as we get into the fall, the concern is that that could come much earlier, again, as physical contact begins to increase, as people are sort of out and about in communities, and in businesses. That's one of the big concerns that we have, and sort of represented by our new worst case scenario here as we've torn apart our modeling and really revisited that. Again, I think the worst case now, very different than what we were talking about when this virus was back in really the exponential phases of growth that we saw back in early March, for instance.
Well, tell us about that potential second wave and what you're calling a reacceleration that you're seeing in the numbers in several states, including those that have recently reopened, like Florida, Texas, and Georgia. What are you seeing in those states in particular?
So minor reaccelerations, again, really driven by some of the city centers within those states. And again, some of those numbers really not necessarily representative of what's happening across the entirety of the state. Similar to what's happening in New York. Obviously, New York City really driving the majority of the infections in the state. In Georgia, it's Atlanta. Again, similarly in Texas, it's those metropolitan areas. Some of the reopening, the economic reopening within those centers looks very different than what's happening in the rest of the state. So again, very hard to sort of tease out what's going on around economic reopening with what's actually happening with some of those COVID numbers, because some of the more rural areas can be reopening quite effectively without a serious spread of the virus, whereas some of the metropolitan areas, it is a little bit of a bigger concern, maybe not reopening to the extent that some of the areas are there.
And tell us about what your worst case modeling now shows. You cite a potential return to almost exponential growth as the economic reopening potentially initiates another wave of viral spread. So what does that start to look like, and when could we potentially be seeing that again?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. So the way we are thinking about that is sort of within 1 to 2 weeks of really major economic reopening, again, in some of these metropolitan areas. As we're looking at this within our model, we're looking for signs of that sort of in mid-May, again, as we're thinking a number of these major metropolitan areas might be reopening. What that looks like from sort of the shape of this curve, as we've looked at in the past, initially talking about the U.S. situation back in February, back in March, that was when we were in the early phases of exponential growth. The doubling time was at its shortest. The cases were doubling every 1.6 days. I don't think we're going back to that, but I think we could move back to sort of a sub-exponential phase of growth, which is where we were back in sort of early April, as before cases really plateaued in mid-April, and we actually hit the peak there. But again, it's not clear at all to me that we are moving towards a recovery, even though you are seeing that in several cities. Because I think the dynamic that's actually influencing that recovery is just the social distancing. Like, no one is going out. Everyone is staying at home. As soon as that eases, we will still have some behavioral changes that really will still help reduce the spread versus what we saw before. But that increased physical contact, I think, very much could lead to a resurgence in cases.
Well, Kennen MacKay, we'll stick with you to keep watching the numbers, and we appreciate you joining us again tonight.
Thanks
Scott,
for having me.
back over to you.
All right, Kennen MacKay, appreciate it very much. Meg, of course, thank you as well. Dr. Gottlieb, you're still with us. I said goodbye to you too soon. I want you to react to what Kennen MacKay said. Not clear we're moving towards a recovery, talks about a sub-exponential growth. Does that match up with your thinking?
I think it matches up with a lot of our concerns. We always knew that as we reopened the economy, we were going to get a bump up in cases. It wasn't going to go down. It was going to go up slightly. The challenge is that it's going to go up off of an already high baseline. We haven't reduced the amount of spread in the country to the levels that we would have thought we'd be at right now. When you look at some of the models like the CHOP model, if you want to look at the glass half full and look at what could be an optimistic picture, what they model is that when you make small changes in your behaviors, when people maybe go shopping once a week instead of twice, when you do that over a population, it actually can affect the growth of the epidemic, and you can keep the R, what we call the R, the number of new cases that you get for each case that you have, at or below 1, and that would be the goal. And so hopefully as we come out of this epidemic, people are cautious enough that their behaviors have changed that we can mitigate really exponential growth again. But we are going to get a growth in cases over the course of May as we reopen, and we're coming off a high baseline. And so the risk is that we continue to have spread really all through the summer at some level of about 20 or 30,000 cases being diagnosed on a daily basis. And that's a lot because we know we're not diagnosing a lot of cases. We're diagnosing probably 1 in 10 to 1 in 20 of the actual cases.
Speaking of reopening, I asked earlier on Twitter of folks who were in states that were reopening, what are you seeing on the ground? Michael Farr, who's a CNBC contributor, just wrote to me, Florida's reopening. People are on the beaches. People are in restaurants and at sidewalk tables. No face masks. Waiters don't have masks. Folks seem really happy to be back out. I'm sure they are happy to be out. When you hear that of people out, no face masks, what do you think?
Look, that's concerning because what we would hope for is that when people do start to re-engage in activity, they take some additional precautions. They don't just go out the way they used to, and we sort of take it slow, that people, do naturally social distance, they wear face masks, they practice good hygiene, restaurants take precautions. If it's sort of back to business as usual, that's going to be more concerning, that you could start to see more rapid acceleration in cases. Now, Florida hasn't had as extensive of an epidemic based on what we know, as we expected. So Florida, dodged this to some extent, although they're not testing a lot. So we don't have a full scope of the amount of infection that they have down there. But there's a lot of states where you're still seeing growth in cases. There's more than 20 states right now where the number of daily cases is going up, not down. Now we're testing more, so we're capturing more. But even against that backdrop, it does seem to be expanding in a number of states.
I'm afraid this truly is goodbye. Dr. Gottlieb, we'll see you tomorrow night.
Thanks a lot.